In October 2011, the world watched as one of the most controversial leaders of the modern era met a violent and chaotic end. Muammar Gaddafi, the man who had ruled Libya for more than 4 decades, was captured while fleeing his hometown, hunted from the sky, and surrounded on the ground. Official statements at the time described his death as an unfortunate consequence of war, unplanned, unavoidable, and unintended. But as more details emerged, that explanation began to unravel. NATO surveillance aircraft tracked his convoy in real time. US Predator drones monitored movements from thousands of miles away. French fighter jets struck key targets, disabling vehicles and forcing survivors to scatter. Piece by piece, a clearer picture formed, one that raised serious questions about whether this was truly an accident of war, or the final act of a carefully coordinated operation. The claim that no one intended for Gaddafi to die becomes harder to accept when the full chain of events is laid out. This story is not only about the fall of a single leader, it is about power, influence, and the unspoken rules of global politics. It is about what happens when a head of state challenges entrenched systems and long-standing interests. And it is about how narratives are shaped, who is labeled a villain, who is called a liberator, and who gets to decide the difference. In this video, we will follow the final hours of Muammar Gaddafi step by step, examine the roles played by foreign powers, and explore why his death still matters today far beyond Libya's borders. Stay with us as we connect the dots, separate fact from rhetoric, and uncover a side of the story that is rarely discussed. If you value in-depth analysis, historical context, chemistms and stories that challenge surface-level explanations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who want to understand the deeper forces shaping our world. As the smoke cleared from the highway outside Sirte, and the images of Muammar Gaddafi's final moments circled the globe, a deeper question lingered beneath the official explanations. Beyond the language of humanitarian intervention and civilian protection, there was another story unfolding, one that did not begin in 2011 and did not end with the collapse of the Libyan state. To understand why Gaddafi became a target of such overwhelming international force, it is necessary to look beyond Libya itself and toward the idea that defined his final years in power: African unity. For decades, Gaddafi had positioned himself not only as Libya's leader, but as a vocal advocate for a continent that spoke with one voice. In international forums, he argued that Africa's greatest weakness was not a lack of resources, talent, or history, but fragmentation. Dozens of borders drawn during the colonial era had turned the continent into a collection of small, vulnerable states, each negotiating alone with far stronger global powers. To Gaddafi, this imbalance was not accidental. It was the very condition that allowed external influence to persist long after the end of formal colonial rule. His vision went far beyond symbolic cooperation. He spoke openly about a unified African defense, a shared foreign policy, and a financial system that would reduce dependence on external institutions. He supported the idea of an African-backed currency and stronger continental institutions capable of standing on equal footing with Europe, the United States, and emerging powers in Asia, whether one agreed with his methods or not. His ambition was clear. A united Africa would no longer negotiate from a position of weakness. This was not the first time such ideas had emerged. The dream of continental unity had echoed through Africa since the mid-20th century, championed by leaders who believed political independence meant little without economic and strategic self-determination. Again and again, those figures found themselves isolated, removed from power, or silenced altogether. Over time, a pattern appeared. Calls for unity were praised in theory, but when they moved closer to practical implementation, Resistance followed swiftly. What made Gaddafi different was timing and resources. By the late 2000s, Libya was financially strong, diplomatically active across Africa, and positioned at the crossroads of Europe and the continent. Gaddafi used that position to fund infrastructure, support regional initiatives, and amplify his message on a global stage. For many outside observers, this raised uncomfortable questions. A more integrated Africa, with independent financial tools and collective bargaining power, would inevitably alter existing political and economic relationships that had remained largely unchanged for generations. Seen through this lens, the events of 2011 take on a different meaning. The intervention in Libya was presented as a response to internal unrest. Yet its outcome removed one of the most persistent advocates of continental unity at a critical moment. The collapse that followed did not spread stability across the region. Instead, it served as a warning. The idea of African unity survived, but the cost of pushing too far, too fast, had been made unmistakably clear. In the years since, Africa has continued to debate integration through trade agreements, regional alliances, Kyrgyzstan turns, and diplomatic coordination. These efforts move cautiously, shaped by history and by the knowledge that unity is not merely an internal challenge, but one deeply entangled with global power dynamics. Gaddafi's story, then, is not simply about a fallen leader. It is a chapter in a much longer narrative about who benefits from division, who fears unity, and why the idea of a truly independent Africa has always carried consequences far beyond the continent itself. The story of Muammar Gaddafi and his vision for a united Africa cannot be understood in isolation. It is part of a long and complex history stretching back over a century, a history in which external powers meticulously shaped the continent's political landscape to serve their own interests. In 1884, representatives from European nations convened in Berlin for a conference that would forever alter the trajectory of Africa, a meeting where the fates of millions were decided without a single African voice present. The Berlin Conference was ostensibly about regulating colonization and trade, but in practice, it codified the division of Africa into spheres of influence, legitimizing the seizure of land, resources, and people. The continent was carved like a pie, and the map drawn in that conference room became the framework for control that would endure far beyond the colonial period, embedding patterns of exploitation and division that leaders like Gaddafi would later seek to challenge. From that moment onward, the external hand in African affairs became both overt and insidious. Nations that dared to assert independence or push for continental cohesion often found themselves undermined, destabilized, or violently removed. Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, envisioned a country free from external interference, a nation that could harness its vast resources for the benefit of its people. Yet his efforts were met with clandestine opposition and eventually assassination. A stark reminder that independence could be a dangerous ambition. Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first president and a contemporary visionary for Pan-African unity, faced coups orchestrated with foreign support. His dream of a continent speaking with one voice repeatedly threatened by powers invested in keeping Africa fragmented. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, pursued policies of self-sufficiency, education, and healthcare that directly challenged entrenched economic and political interests, and his life was cut short in a violent coup that echoed the same pattern. Gaddafi entered this historical continuum, fully aware that his advocacy for African unity carried risks that extended far beyond Libya's borders. He was not merely a national leader. He was a symbol of possibility, a figure who sought to reverse the centuries-old trajectory set by the Berlin Conference by promoting a single African currency, continental defense strategies, and collective negotiation on the global stage. He posed a challenge to a system that had relied on the continent's disunity. This system had long benefited from weak, divided states whose leaders were often beholden to external interests, creating an environment where resources could be extracted, influence maintained, and strategic decisions made without opposition. Gaddafi's plans threatened to upset this balance, not through conquest, but by uniting voices that had historically been kept separate, amplifying the potential power of millions who had long been treated as politically subordinate in international affairs. The recurring pattern of intervention, subversion, and targeted removal underscores the continuity of Western influence from the Berlin Conference to the modern era. Each leader who championed African self-determination was not merely facing internal challenges. They were contending with the weight of a global structure designed to preserve inequality and dependence. The tragedies of Lumumba, Nkrumah, Sankara, and ultimately Gaddafi reveal that the struggle for African unity is as much about resisting historical patterns of external control as it is about forging internal consensus. Their stories are linked by a thread of ambition, hope, and resilience, but also by the cost of challenging a deeply entrenched order. In understanding this continuum, one sees that Gaddafi's final struggle was not an isolated episode of conflict, but a decisive moment in a century-long contest over who shapes the future of Africa, a contest that continues to echo in the continent's ongoing pursuit of self-determination and cohesion. Long before the chaos of 2011 engulfed Libya, the country under Muammar Gaddafi presented a very different picture, one that complicates the simple labels often assigned to him in international discourse. Beneath the headlines portraying him as a dictator lay a society structured around social welfare in a way few nations at the time could rival. Education and healthcare were provided freely to all citizens, a policy that dramatically increased literacy rates and improved public health across the country, creating opportunities that reached every corner of Libya. Children learned without the burden of fees. Families could access hospitals without concern for costs, and medical treatment abroad was funded by the state when necessary, reflecting a vision of social responsibility that ran counter to the narratives of repression. Housing, too, became a pillar of Gaddafi's domestic policy. Newlyweds received substantial support to establish families, while citizens who wished to cultivate farms were provided with seeds, livestock, and essential appliances. The government even subsidized car purchases and controlled the cost of basic commodities like bread and gasoline, effectively reducing living expenses and allowing ordinary Libyans to participate in the economy with less financial strain. Oil revenues, managed by the state, were not merely a source of national wealth, but a mechanism to directly benefit the population, distributing resources in ways that supported livelihoods and reduced dependence on private or foreign interests. In practical terms, Libya was striving toward an economic model that prioritized the well-being of its people, creating a system of security, stability, and opportunity rarely seen in other parts of Africa at the time. This framework was more than policy. It was a statement of intent. By empowering citizens economically and socially, Gaddafi challenged the assumptions of what a North African state could achieve independently. The infrastructure, services, education, and health initiatives were not isolated acts but interconnected strategies aimed at self-sufficiency and collective upliftment. Schools and universities flourished, public services expanded, and large-scale irrigation projects transformed arid regions into arable land, illustrating a commitment to development that combined vision with tangible results. To many Libyans, these achievements were proof of leadership that prioritized the populace rather than external alliances or elite enrichment. Yet the very success of these programs heightened suspicion and hostility abroad. A prosperous, Self-sufficient Libya represented a model that diverged from Western expectations for African nations, particularly those rich in natural resources. Gaddafi's policies empowered his people while simultaneously providing him leverage to pursue broader goals, such as continental unity and reduced dependence on international financial systems. It was this combination of domestic achievement and regional ambition that made him a figure of both admiration and concern. Admired for his social programs, yet feared for the potential of his vision to disrupt established power structures. When 2011 arrived, the stark contrast between the pre-war Libya and the fractured nation that followed could not have been more apparent. The dismantling of social programs, the rise of conflict among rival factions, and the loss of state-managed infrastructure revealed how quickly stability could unravel without the framework that Gaddafi had established. The narrative of a dictator controlling a repressed population was now challenged by the lived experience of citizens who had enjoyed free education, healthcare, housing, support, and financial backing for basic life needs. Understanding Libya before 2011 is essential to grasp the full scope of what was lost and why Gaddafi's removal was not only a political event but a turning point that reshaped the lives of millions and the trajectory of a nation poised for self-directed development and continental influence. The Libya that emerged after Muammar Gaddafi's removal was almost unrecognizable from the nation he had carefully shaped over decades, a transformation that exposed the fragility of a country suddenly deprived of the central authority that had maintained social and economic stability. Where once free education, health care, and extensive social support had created a sense of security and opportunity, now fragmentation became the defining feature of the nation. Rival governments claimed authority over different regions, each asserting legitimacy while struggling to provide even basic services, and in the absence of a unified state, lawlessness spread across the country. The vacuum left by Gaddafi's centralized governance allowed armed groups and militias to seize control of towns, oil facilities, and strategic infrastructure, turning the very landscapes that had once been productive and prosperous into battlegrounds. Economic collapse followed swiftly behind the breakdown of security. Libya's oil, the cornerstone of its wealth, and the driver of the social programs that had defined daily life under Gaddafi, became a contested resource rather than a shared national asset. Production fluctuated violently as armed groups battled over control of refineries and pipelines, while corruption and the lack of institutional oversight eroded revenues that had once funded schools, hospitals, and citizen stipends. Inflation surged, basic goods became scarce, and everyday life was suddenly characterized by uncertainty rather than stability. Families who had once benefited from housing assistance or subsidized essentials now faced rising costs, scarcity, and a disorienting collapse of systems they had taken for granted. The economic engine that had propelled Libya into relative prosperity ground to a halt, leaving citizens struggling to survive in conditions that contrasted starkly with the social security they had known. The security situation was equally dire. Kidnappings, assassinations, and attacks on both civilians and foreign personnel became commonplace, driving a climate of fear that permeated daily life. International governments issued travel warnings advising their citizens against venturing into Libya, citing the high risk of terrorism, armed clashes, and pervasive criminal activity. Public infrastructure crumbled under the strain of conflict and neglect. Hospitals struggled to function without essential supplies, and schools closed or operated intermittently, leaving an entire generation deprived of the opportunities that had previously been guaranteed by the state. The absence of a functioning police force in many areas created a lawless environment where disputes were settled by militias rather than courts, further entrenching the cycle of instability. Even culturally and socially, the loss of cohesion was palpable. Communities that had once operated under a centralized social contract found themselves divided along tribal, regional, and political lines, each faction vying for influence or survival in the new reality. The unifying vision of a prosperous Libya, and by extension a unified Africa that Gaddafi had championed, seemed to recede into history, replaced by fragmentation and short-term survival. The narrative of liberation that had been celebrated during the initial uprising gave way to disillusionment as citizens confronted the stark realities of a state stripped of coherent governance. In the years following his removal, Libya's transformation from a country with extensive social welfare and relative stability into a fractured, insecure, and economically unstable nation serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abrupt intervention and power vacuums. The contrast between the promise of Gaddafi's Libya and the chaos that followed illustrates how quickly national stability can unravel when institutional structures are dismantled, leaving citizens to navigate a landscape defined by uncertainty, violence, and scarcity, a reality that starkly underscores the human cost of political upheaval and foreign intervention. Even as Libya continues to struggle with fragmentation and instability, some elements of Muammar Gaddafi's vision for Africa have begun to re-emerge in the form of continental initiatives, offering a glimpse of what might have been had his dream of unity been allowed to take root. The African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA, represents one of the most ambitious attempts to integrate Africa's economies, reduce barriers to trade, and enable the free movement of goods, services, and, eventually, people across national borders. This modern initiative echoes Gaddafi's decades-long advocacy for a united Africa, where countries could leverage collective strength to negotiate on equal footing with global powers and build sustainable prosperity from within the continent. The AfCFTA, which currently involves 44 out of 54 African Union member states, provides a platform for countries to begin overcoming the economic and political fragmentation that has long limited Africa's potential. By facilitating intra-African trade, harmonizing regulations, and gradually moving toward a single market, it seeks to create the kind of economic foundation that Gaddafi envisioned with his proposed African Authority. Entrepreneurs, investors, and ordinary citizens now have an opportunity to benefit from reduced tariffs, streamlined trade procedures, and wider access to markets beyond their own national borders, creating the potential for Africa to assert more autonomy in global economic affairs. However, the path toward unity remains fraught with challenges: political divisions between states, historical rivalries, customs and racism, and differing national priorities complicate efforts to implement a truly integrated continental framework. External influences, customs and racism, both historical and ongoing, continue to shape the policies of individual nations, often constraining the bold reforms required to realize a fully unified Africa. Visa restrictions, currency differences, and uneven infrastructure development highlight the obstacles that still lie ahead, demonstrating that Gaddafi's vision, while inspirational, will require sustained political will, cooperation, and determination to become a reality. Even with these hurdles, AfCFTA represents a step forward, a partial fulfillment of the long-suppressed aspirations for African unity. It is a reminder that ideas can outlast the individuals who champion them, and that progress often arrives slowly, built upon incremental gains rather than sudden transformation. The struggles and sacrifices of past leaders like Gaddafi, Lumumba, Sankara, and Nkrumah serve as both cautionary tales and enduring inspiration, showing that the dream of a self-reliant, united Africa remains alive, even amid adversity. As we reflect on these developments, it becomes clear that the story of Gaddafi and post-2011 Libya is more than a tale of one nation's rise and fall. It is part of a larger narrative about Africa's potential, its challenges, and the forces both internal and external that have shaped its course. By understanding the past, we gain insight into the present, and perhaps guidance for the future. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the legacy of Gaddafi and the ongoing journey toward African unity. If you found this story insightful, do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more in-depth explorations of history, politics, and the forces shaping our world. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light.